Hello and welcome to Viewpoints. I'm Andrew Phelps. Joining us today is Chaz Eby of the Maryland Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. Today, Chaz will be talking to us about his award-winning thesis, The Nation That Cried Lone Wolf, a data-driven analysis of individual terrorists in the United States since 9/11. Welcome, Chaz.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
So, Chaz, what initially brought you to the idea and the concept and made you want to study lone wolf terrorists in the United States?
Well, it's certainly a germane topic. Both in the United States and abroad, we've seen an increase in occurrences of lone wolf terrorism. And yet, when I look back in the literature, there wasn't much on the topic. And furthermore, what was on the topic in the literature was mainly case study and inference, which isn't surprising because it's it's not a new phenomenon, but Homeland Security as a whole is a new science. And it was brought about mainly as an acute need for immediate protection. So there's not a lot of data-driven and statistical analyses of these things. So what I wanted to do was look at the lone wolf phenomenon and gather cases that met that definition, and then gather characteristics across all of those cases, such as age, weapon of choice, the day of a week that they attacked, did they travel or not, across about 40 characteristics, and see what characteristics were significant, which characteristics were related to success or failure for lone wolves, and how those characteristics interacted with each other.
Chaz, you mentioned there wasn't a lot in the literature about lone wolf terrorism. Was there anything that you found while you were doing the research that surprised you?
Certainly. A lot after I did the research and compiled the data, I did find many things that surprised me. Some of the initial thoughts that I had on lone wolf terrorism turned out not to be true. For instance, the age of the average lone wolf terrorist in my population was a little older than I thought. And most lone wolves in the United States actually were born in the United States as opposed to from coming from abroad and then doing that. So that certainly surprised me and was different than the common conception of what a lone wolf terrorist in the U.S. is.
After compiling your research and coming up with the different data points on each of the case studies that you observed on lone wolves, what was the takeaway or the so what? What can we be doing now in the future about lone wolf terrorism?
Well, lone wolves are interesting because there's no one single dispositional profile that you can put on them. There are some contextual clues that may lead to someone becoming a lone wolf terrorist. And what's interesting about a lone wolf is that they have a mix of established ideology, and then they also have personal grievances that they have. And they mix those two things together to essentially form a terrorist group of one person. So it's difficult to come up with a single profile to pick a needle from the haystack approach to finding lone wolves in the United States. However, I think there are some broader things that can be done. I think that community policing is an effective strategy to finding lone wolves and people who are in danger of becoming that. And I think that overall what we'll have to do is these lone wolves have minority viewpoints. They have, like I said, viewpoints that they've gathered from perceived ideologies and grievances, and they want to attack to assuage their anger at the community that they feel doesn't agree with their minority viewpoints at all. And for the most part, that's true. So I think that there needs to be a way to almost demarginalize these people. Of course not embrace their viewpoints because they're radical and they're violent for the most part, but rather demarginalize their views and make them feel like they're part of the community.
So your study tended to look at previous instances of lone wolf terrorism. How many lone wolves had you identified since 9/11?
Sure. So there are 54 cases of lone wolf attacks, attempts, or arrests of individuals who were going to commit an attack very soon after. So a lot of times the FBI, if they had someone, an informant, and they knew someone was about to commit an attack and they arrested them, that would count as well. So 54 cases in the last 10 years. So it's a threat that's been occurring pretty often. However, I do want to emphasize that per attack, it's less than one death caused by each attack. So So you need to weigh that into the threat level that you consider lone wolf terrorism in the U.S.
You took obviously more of a retrospective approach in looking at the identifiers of lone wolf terrorists. Is there things within the data that you found that you think can be applied from a prevention standpoint, things that we can do to stop someone who could become a lone wolf or is in the stages of being a lone wolf terrorist to prevent them from carrying out an attack?
Sure. Well, the main reason I wanted to do this study this way, it's hard to be used as a predictive model. However, it can be used to build a core knowledge of understanding on the topic. I think it'll be very useful for both law enforcement and the Homeland Security community. Some of the things that I found that might be helpful to these groups are that the majority of the lone wolves in the last 10 years have been born in the United States. Many of them have actually used explosive devices, bombs, and yet for the cases that have used bombs, they've been less likely to be successful than those cases that used firearms in attacks. And that actually goes against some of the previous literature for lone wolves in the world outside of the U.S. Other things that I found were that many lone wolves travel outside of their immediate vicinity where they live. However, they're less likely to be successful if they travel. So I think that information and some of my other findings can be used by those communities to help develop policy that can be useful. And one other thing is that many of the conclusions that I reach are different than the characteristics of group terrorists. And I feel like in the United States, much of the policy we have is based on group terrorism. And in order to be effective against lone wolf terrorists, separate policy will have to be made.
Is that something that you see yourself pursuing, looking at policy options for addressing the lone wolf terrorist threat?
I certainly think that the next step, that future research will have to be done first and foremost on policy options to address lone wolf terrorism, and also to see exactly what the differences are between group terrorism and lone wolf terrorism.
Excellent. Well done on winning the Thesis Award. It's a truly amazing research and sheds some light on a certainly emerging threat here in the United States. And thank you for being with us today, Chaz.
Thank you, Andrew.